necessarily goes through urbanization. So the share of composition of GDP of in any country where GDP per capita is growing, the share of agriculture continues to fall. The share of manufacturing and services rises. So people come off the land and they seek jobs and are provided opportunities in other parts of the economy that generate what is called higher value added, whether it's in services or it is in manufacturing. These industries, these activities thrive in cities. So urbanization is a necessary rite of passage for development. You cannot avoid it. You have to embrace it, right? And yet we've been reluctant to do it. So I think it's the first time, I mean, that's why this new administration, the Modi government's focus on smart cities is extremely important, because hopefully it now marks a pragmatic shift of gear, even in the political vocabulary, that for us to be successful politically, let's say as a party that wants to be re-elected, focusing on the future of our cities is now becoming important. So we are at a, to re-emphasize your point, as a very important turning point. How do you create, how do you regenerate our cities? I mean, it's no secret that our cities, the quality of life in our cities is deteriorating very rapidly. A lot of it has to do with resources. It's not just resources, but a lot of it has to do with resources. How have cities generated resources elsewhere in the world? I'll give you the example of China, because in the last 30 years, they are a country of bigger size than even ourselves, that have gone through this rapid process of development. What the Chinese did, which only they could do, by the way, so I should add that caveat, but what they did was very interesting, right? They generated the resources for developing their cities by using the value of land. So all land in China belonged to the state, so that made it very convenient and much easier for them, right? So, and as urbanization takes place, and the use of land changes from agriculture to non-agriculture, its value tends to rise very dramatically. You can see that in any city in India, you know, on the outskirts of the city, the moment land use changes, that's the magic. The value of that piece of land shoots up. So because that land belonged to the state itself in China, they were able to capture the accretion in value of land that came with urbanization, and were able to redeploy it in the development of physical infrastructure of the municipalities. So the municipalities owned the land. As the land grew in value, they managed to sell it or lease it to non-agricultural uses. They then used the proceeds to develop their cities. This is how Shanghai has become what it is. This is how Guangzhou has become what it is today. This is how Shenzhen was developed, right? In our case, the state doesn't own that land. And therefore, that accretion in value that is occurring in our country is being captured by the private. And we don't have, or we haven't had the political courage or the administrative discipline to tax that accretion in value in order to redeploy it into development of urban infrastructure. So my simple suggestion is that this is riddled with vested interest, but it's a problem that we really need to address. At the time when the decision to change the use of land is made, at that point, why cannot we introduce a system of taxation at that point? There'll be a lot of political opposition against it, surely, but that is the point of capture, and it taxes the right person for the increase in value that then that then can be deployed for use for development of physical infrastructure. Second quick point I wanted to make on resources, generating the resources for creating our smart cities, is that another very unique circumstance that we in India find ourselves in, compared to any other democracy in the world, right, is that we got universal suffrage before all the untidy work of economic development was done. Do you know that in the United States they didn't get full universal suffrage until the civil rights movement in the 1960s? But anywhere else in Europe, they didn't get universal suffrage till the 1920s when women were finally given the vote, right? So they only got proper, till then, I mean, through the much of the 19th century, voting was actually restricted to a relatively small group of people, which meant that, you know, the business of redistribution of wealth wasn't as politically important for those countries. And so a lot of stuff could be done, which would have otherwise caused a lot of strife. But it went under the carpet, so to speak. It was only then that universal suffrage came, and then you got the New Deal in the United States, you got the welfare state in all of Europe, right? That's when redistribution really started. We started from the very first day with universal suffrage. And so our challenge is is immense, because politically we cannot ignore issues of redistributive justice, because politically that would be suicide. So finding the balance between redistributive justice and the untidy work of actually developing is very tough. And when it comes to the distribution of land and wealth, which is a lot of it is tied up with land, you know, that explains a lot about the battles we are having around the land acquisition bill. It's a hugely emotive issue for us, right? There was no such issues, you know, in 19th century UK. There was no such issues in 19th century United States. But we have to face these issues, which makes it very hard for us to fully charge, and this is the point I wanted to make in the context of smart cities, to fully charge the user for the services the citizen is using, right? It would be politically impossible in our country to charge people market price for water. Although we know that water scarcity is becoming a reality day by day, right? We are not able politically to charge the market price for energy, for coal-based energy. And yet we have a responsibility to deliver sustainable growth, which means that we have to rely on more expensive forms of energy, solar and wind, renewables, right? But politically, we cannot charge the market price. We cannot charge the full market price for transportation in our cities. So if we are not going to be able to rely on user charges to fund the development of this critical infrastructure for our cities, where will our resources come from doing that? So, therefore I go back to finding some way of unlocking the value of land and adjusting our taxation base in such a way that we can actually do that, raise resources, and protect the Aam Aadmi, the poorest citizen, from actually paying the true and escalating price of all these essential services that are the lifeblood of any city. So we have to find a solution that is non-market for how we fund the development of physical infrastructure in our cities. Last point I wanted to make is now, therefore, what is the role of the private sector in all of this, right? Now, when you look at the role of private participation in developing infrastructure in our country, it really started in the 1990s. And it started in the 1990s following a fiscal crisis, which was the 1991 crisis, right? What was happening till 1991 is that the share of total resources, tax resources that the government has been raising, that have gone on subsidies and politically important redistributive instruments, has become progressively so large that it left very little fiscal space for us to spend on developing physical infrastructure. Government didn't have the money. But physical infrastructure has, as I was arguing a few minutes ago, very important public characteristics, right? Not all infrastructure can be developed just by a private company, because a private company, if it invests, must get a proper market return on it. But if you're delivering a public service, you may not want or be able to charge a completely market-driven price for it. And therefore, you have to find some budgetary resources to be able to fund it. We didn't have any because of the growing share of our subsidies and other redistributive instruments that I've described. Hence, very pragmatically, what did the government do? What did we do in the 1990s? We said, look, government has no money. Although we should be funding infrastructure, we don't have the money. So what are we going to do? We are going to invite the private sector to do it. So we went from one extreme, where government was doing everything, to relying progressively entirely on the private sector. And in the last decade, you know, the battle cry for private participation in infrastructure, in retrospect, was made for partly all the wrong reasons. Wrong reasons why? Because, you know, we are not inviting the private sector because they are more efficient at delivering these services, or they'll do a better job of delivering these services. Actually, the reality is we've invited the private sector because we don't have money to discharge our state responsibilities. So that was the context in which the private sector became involved in developing infrastructure in the country. Even as the private sector was invited to do this, the government, which was doing this purely as an expeditious, as a matter of convenience, right? Because they were forced to, their mental attitude towards managing and overseeing the private sector hasn't changed, right? So what was the mental attitude of government all these years? This is what we talk about Nehruvian socialism, right? So you have the commanding heights, the state is the paternalistic center that provides the pinnacle even of industry for the country, right? That's what the bureaucracy, several generations of our government have grown up on. In that vocabulary, the private sector are not really to be trusted, right? And so the attitude of mind of government in this context, while the reality is we must have private participation, but the attitude with which they are dealt with, or the private sector is dealt with, is that I suspect whatever you do, I must regulate very harshly what you do, and I don't have the full capacity to regulate you because I don't have the sophistication. And then I'm often duped by, by very sophisticated private sector players because they're just more sophisticated. We don't have the administrative capacity to design systems, to administer, and forget about nurturing private participation in infrastructure. Whenever the private is involved in this kind of context with the public, there are bound to be disputes. We don't have a proper dispute resolution mechanism that is predictable, quick, transparent, right? Everything is relegated to the courts. We have specialized courts, but everything goes in appeal. And then once it goes in appeals, it comes back to the regular judiciary that is totally overburdened, not only because of the caseload, but because of lack of expertise. So we don't have, in a nutshell, the institutional infrastructure. We haven't evolved the institutional infrastructure to invite the private sector to take the risk of developing greenfield infrastructure of the nature they have actually done over the last 10 years, 15 years. And that is in large part contributed to the situation we are in. Right? So there's lack of trust between public and private. And now people have lost money, the banks have lost money, so nobody is willing to finance new infrastructure. So we are in a bit of a mess. So what do we do under these circumstances? Just to recap very, very quickly, the reality is that we need the private sector because we don't have the resources just as government to develop the physical infrastructure. But we don't have the institutional mechanisms to get the private sector to take on the risk of the kind they've been asked to take. So my simple suggestion, and I'll stop at that, is to reimagine the partnership between government and the private sector when it comes to infrastructure development. Rather than inviting the private sector to take greenfield risk for infrastructure development, why can't we rely on government to first develop greenfield infrastructure assets, then sell them to private investors? So where the risk is the greatest and the regulatory uncertainty is the greatest, which is at the time of greenfield creation, government takes on that burden, right? And it can use private contractors to build the infrastructure.